I'm going to tell you about a time that the New York Times paid me to lie, and how when I refused to do that, that really seriously hurt my career. And the story, it gets into the weeds a little bit about how journalism works, the organ meat that grinds together to push out the sausage of the news. And telling the story now might still theoretically hurt my career. And the editor that I was working with at the time, I just checked, is still at the New York Times. But it's a problem that infects a lot of what we consider prestigious media. And, well, this is a little hard for me to talk about. So back in 2012, I had just come back from living in India for 6 years, doing research on organ trafficking and criminal networks, and really getting in deep to sort of the dark underbelly of international trade and graft. And I was super psyched to start to be able to work for, increasingly high profile publications. The New Yorker were sending me emails, and the New York Times was jazzed to work with me. I got this big piece in Fast Company. And I came across this story when I had attended a Google conference. So Google throws these huge conferences for their humanitarian efforts. It used to be called Google Ideas. I don't know what they call it now. And the focus was on international counterfeits, organ trading, human trafficking. Pablo Escobar's son spoke at the event. Eric Schmidt, founder of Google, was there. It was a big, big deal. And one of the people I met when I was there was this guy, I think his name was Nathan Sigworth, and he had this company called Pharma Secure. And Pharma Secure existed because there was this big problem in India with counterfeit drugs. So the Indian police had supposedly arrested a bunch of these people who were putting talcum powder and sort of off-brand supplementy drugs or whatever into pill casings and selling them as antibiotics and blood pressure medications and doing these things that could really, really, really get people hurt. So this company, PharmaSecure, came in to address the problem by putting RFID tags on every pharmaceutical package so that when you went to buy a drug from a drugstore, you could scan this RFID tag, and then they would tell you if it actually came from the real manufacturer or if this could have been one of those really sketchy, dangerous drugs that was definitely going to get you killed and not help you get better. And I was like, oh, whoa, this sounds like a really big problem, because I'd seen all sorts of health scams when I was in India. I literally found a village of people where everyone had sold their kidneys. So this was dead center in my beat. The conference happened in LA, and I sent some emails and messages to these editors at the New York Times. I was like, hey, I want to go in and look at this entrepreneur who wants to solve this fake pharmaceutical problem with this innovative tech solution. I was going to be in India anyway because I was launching a book, and I was going to be at this this festival in Bombay. It was going to be rad. So they didn't have to buy my ticket. They just had to give me the assignment. At the time, I think I was getting paid $2 or $3 a word. I think the assignment was for $5,000. Maybe it was $10,000. And I was going to go in and go interview the police and interview this guy. And they were into it. I wrote a really solid pitch. And so I flew out to India. I did my little book fair thing, and I went to investigate with PharmaSecure, and I got some interviews with the bosses and stuff like that. I understand how the technology of securing these drugs works. It was sort of blockchainy before blockchain was a thing that we were investing in crypto in sort of a serious way. But there was one piece of information that I was missing. I needed to find evidence that these fake pharmaceuticals were really an epidemic in India. I had some locations for where some police busts might have happened, and I traveled around. I'd read a bunch of news stories, and I interviewed tons of people around Delhi. I think I was up in Punjab at some point. And while there were a lot of PR touts saying, no, we have a big fake pharmaceutical problem here in India, I actually couldn't find a single police report anywhere in the country of this actually being a problem. The idea of cement mixers, pills, fabrication, counterfeit stuff, that didn't happen anywhere. And at one point I actually went to the head police office in Delhi in this big skyscraper, and I was talking to one cop who'd been quoted in other stories. I was like, I went to his office and I sat down. I was like, I just need to see the report. Like, I know this is a big problem. Everyone's being really upset about this. So if you can just show me any evidence whatsoever, that'd be great. I can go write my story and it's going to be, in the New York Times Magazine. It's going to be a big deal. This was actually really funny. The cop was like, oh yeah, I'll go get it for you. And he's a guy with like stars on his epaulets, like a big, muckety muck. And he walked out of the office and he never came back. I sat in his office for 4 hours waiting for this dude to return. I was like texting him. I was like, where are you? And he ghosted me because, well, the fact was there were no police reports. There was no evidence at all of fake drugs existing. And I later realized what was actually going on is that the companies like Pharma that were trying to solve this fake drug problem were actually probably fronts for Big Pharma writ large, who was really, really worried about all these cheaply available drugs out of India coming to the American market or going abroad and undercutting their profits, because India produces a lot of very cheap drugs that supposedly violate patent law around the world, but they're saving a lot of lives. So they export just like millions of tons of drugs at radically discounted prices. Some of them were making them to America. And Big Pharma had every incentive to cast doubt on the clinical effectiveness and the safety of Indian drugs. I mean, you still see this now when we talk about Canadian drugs being dangerous or bad. That message spreads because American pharmaceutical companies want to spend as much money as possible. But here's where things got really weird with the New York Times. It turned out that the New York Times didn't want a story about Big Pharma running essentially a scam to undermine the credibility of the Indian pharmaceutical market. They wanted the story about the tech entrepreneur, and I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. I wrote this story as best I could about Pharma without including that information. I just wanted to say, hey, he's a cool, interesting, blockchainy tech entrepreneur, but I didn't provide any police reports because I couldn't. There was no actual facts to that. And I wrote this over and over again for my editor at the New York Times, and they kept wanting me to say something that wasn't true, to say that this problem of fake drugs was super real, instead of pointing to the fact that the reason why Pharma actually existed was probably because it was a front for Big Pharma's agenda. And here's the problem. So as a freelance writer, I write pitches. I don't make a salary. I don't really make much money at all. When you write a pitch, you're basically promising that you can deliver what you had written down in your guess about how the world works. But as an investigative journalist, that's really tricky because sometimes the world doesn't match what you expect it will be once you actually do research. That's the beauty of journalism. We actually have to investigate. We actually have to find facts. But when you're writing for a magazine like that, how they pay you is they say, okay, if you get your story and it goes through all the iterations, all the edits and their fact checking and all their departments, we'll pay you at the end of the total research project. But if you don't deliver the story or don't deliver the story in the way we want it to be, we're going to kill it. And you only get, usually it's 10 or 20% of what we promised you up front. So you can do all of this research for months, and it was months of work and rewrites and all this work. And if at the end they're like, well, yeah, sorry, I don't really like it, they will kill the story and you'll be out money. And at that time, I was making very little cash. I hadn't written any of my big books that ended up making a lot of money later. That $5,000 or $10,000 check was really meaningful for me making rent. And when the editor kept on telling me, no, you need to actually show this piece of evidence that you don't have and say it's there, I was in a really, really hard spot. This was the difference of me being able to buy groceries and make rent or not. And eventually I walked from the piece and it sucked. The editor was mad at me. I'll never work with the New York Times Magazine again because I couldn't deliver their lie. And yeah, it was terrible. And then eventually I had this conversation with an editor who had just left the New York Times Magazine. And what he told me was that that magazine assigns at least twice the number of stories that they actually can run because they anticipate that they're going to kill a whole bunch of them. Which way, if you think about it from the freelancer's perspective, that's pretty disingenuous. That's like saying you're going to work for somebody and they know that a giant percentage of the people who were really trying their best to work with them, they were going to give only 25% of the pay. And it worked out well for them because maybe they got better stories. They got the stories that they really wanted to run at the expense of the people who were actually on the field trying to get the facts. This was a huge problem in the media. It makes me understand why there's so little trust for mainstream media, because at that time I cared. I cared so much about getting bylines in prestigious places that made me look like a legitimate journalist. What I didn't realize, and what I have since realized now, is that ultimately, at the end of the day, the ethics of a journalist come down to what they're willing to lose for a report and for telling the truth. And good reporters out there continually make sacrifices from their financial well-being in order to tell the truth because we're passionate about what we do. Anyway, so that's my story about how the New York Times wanted me to lie and how not doing that really actually hurt my career for a long time until I was able to start, getting my feet under me. And so that's my story. I could probably talk about this a little bit more. There's a lot of ins and outs of the publishing industry that a lot of people don't know about. If you'd like to find out more about the stuff that I do, like and subscribe down below. And I also have this Substack newsletter. And if you like independent journalism, feisty independent journalism, I'd love you to go subscribe to it. And if you want to be a premium supporter and give me $8 a month, you would be keeping this roof over my head because we're at another crossroads in the time of journalism. And as you'll see in a video that I have coming out next week on my main channel about one of the biggest financial grifters in the world, how he sued one of the biggest wellness scammers, and how that exposed corruption in the Trump administration. That's the sort of journalism that I can do now because I'm independent. This sort of stuff doesn't exist without your help. From Poke Bear LLC in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney's Back Channel.